In May 2025, one of the most successful musicians alive bought something she had already made. 6 albums, her songs, her voice, recorded across the first decade of her career. The reported price was around $360 million. She wrote the words, she sang every note. Hundreds of millions of people had already paid to hear them. She still had to buy them back. And nothing illegal happened anywhere in that chain. Nobody was defrauded. That is the uncomfortable part. This is simply how the machine is built. Someone signs a contract in their early 20s, and years later the sound of their own voice is an asset on a stranger's balance sheet, being resold between companies she has never met. So who owned those recordings in the meantime? And what exactly did they own? Why was a decade-old catalog worth more than $1/3 billion? And in an industry moving more than $31 billion a year, who is standing between the listener and the musician, taking a percentage of every transaction in between? Because this is not one business. It is a ladder. 7 levels, stacked on top of each other, and each one changes the answer to 3 questions. Who gets paid, who owns the asset, and who controls access to it? At the bottom, you make the thing. Higher up, someone else owns the thing. At the very top, someone owns the door. Start at the bottom, where almost nobody is getting paid at all. Tonight, somewhere, a song is being finished on a laptop in a bedroom. Tomorrow, it can be on every streaming service on Earth for roughly the price of a takeaway. That used to be the hard part. It required a record deal and a pressing plant. Now it requires a card payment, which is why nearly 13 million people have uploaded at least one track to Spotify. The company estimates around 250,000 of them are seriously attempting a career. Here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about what happens next. There is no price per play, no rate card. Every subscription fee and every advertising dollar drops into one enormous monthly pool, and each rights holder receives a share of that pool proportional to their share of all the listening that month. Your song does not have a price, it has a percentage, which means your income can fall while your streams stay flat, simply because more music arrived and the pool got divided more ways. Work backwards from published payouts, and you get an approximate effective rate somewhere between 1/3 of a cent and 1/2 cent per stream. And that figure swings hard depending on the listener's country and whether they pay for a subscription. As rough industry maths, it takes something like 250,000 plays to generate $1,000. And since April 2024, there is a floor beneath the floor. A track that fails to reach 1,000 streams in a rolling 12-month window earns nothing at all, not a fraction of a cent. Zero. Spotify's own reporting gives the clearest picture of this level. In 2025, the 100,000th highest-earning artist on the platform generated just over $7,300. That is real progress. 10 years earlier, the artist in that position made around $350. But sit with what it describes. Being the 100,000th most successful musician on the largest music platform in history is not a career. It is a hobby that occasionally buys a laptop. At level 1, you owned everything and earned nothing. So you do what musicians have always done when the recordings won't pay. You get in a van, a sold-out room of 1,500 people, tickets gone in a week. From the outside, this is the moment it worked. Follow one ticket. Fees come off before anything else. Production, staging, sound, lights, security, and venue staff take the next slice. What survives is split with the promoter, typically around 85-15 in the artist's favor. Then the artist pays the band, the crew, the tour manager, the vans, the hotels, the per diems, the insurance, the agent, and the manager, all out of their own share. Road managers surveyed by the touring body, NIDO, worked this through on a $100 ticket. The artist's final profit was around $8. Scale it up, and the shape holds. One 2026 analysis of touring profit and loss modeled 12 headline dates in 1,500 capacity rooms. Ticket and merchandise revenue of roughly $480,000. From the outside, that tour grossed nearly $500,000. After every business standing between the audience and the artist had been paid, 4 musicians split somewhere between $35,000 and $65,000 for about 6 weeks, including travel. The tour was a success. The venues did well. The promoter did well. The artist simply wasn't the business. And at that size, something strange happens. The merch table usually out-earns the box office, which is exactly why the merch table has its own toll. Venues commonly take between 15 and 30% of gross merchandise sales, sometimes more. not of profit, of gross. The house takes a cut of a shirt it did not design, print, ship, or sell. There is a quiet distinction inside that rule that touring bands trade like a secret. The cut usually applies to soft goods, apparel. It often applies little or not at all to hard goods, meaning vinyl and CDs. Change what is on the table, and you keep more of the same evening. At level 2, you finally earn and discover how many people have standing to be paid before you. Then, after one of those shows, someone from a label is waiting by the merch table. Imagine watching $100,000 land in your account before you have sold anything else. For the first time, it feels like the industry has decided you are real. Then you read the contract. That money is not a payment. It is an advance, a loan against income the record has not earned yet. And it is not repaid the way a bank loan is repaid. It is repaid through the economics of the deal itself. Under a traditional major label structure, 3 things happen at once. The label owns the master recordings, the finished audio files themselves. The artist earns a royalty on those recordings, typically somewhere between 15 and 20%. And the label recovers the advance, plus other recoupable costs, out of the artist's royalty account, not out of its own. So the artist never writes a check back. The record repays the label on the artist's behalf, using the artist's share, at 15 or 20 cents on the dollar. Run it. A $100,000 advance against a 15% royalty needs the release to generate in the region of $667,000 before the artist sees one additional dollar. And most contracts add recording costs, video budgets, marketing, and tour support to that same balance, so the real figure climbs well past the headline. Then there is a clause that quietly decides more careers than the advance does. Cross-collateralization. In plain terms, the label can settle the losses on your first album using the income from your third, which means a record can be a genuine hit and still pay the artist nothing, because it is clearing debts the artist stopped thinking about years ago. And from the label's side, the structure is elegant. Fail completely and you own nothing. You simply never own anything either. Compare it with the modern distribution deal, where the artist keeps the masters and takes 70 to 85% of net revenue. On identical income, the same advance clears several times faster, and at the end, the artist is still holding the asset. The question at level 3 was never how large the advance is. It is whose money is used to pay it back. But there is a second piece of property inside every song, and it was never mentioned in that meeting. Every song is 2 separate assets. They are owned separately, they are paid separately, and almost nobody outside the industry knows the difference. The first is the composition, the words and the melody, the song as it exists on paper before anyone plays it. The second is the master, one specific recorded performance of that composition, the recipe, and the meal. 2 different owners, 2 different pipes, 2 different pools of money. A label that buys your masters has bought the meal. It can sell that meal forever. It cannot stop you writing the recipe out again. The master is the larger earner, and it flows to the artist and the label. The composition pays the songwriter through 2 separate channels that both fire on a single stream, and together they come to roughly 1/10 to 2/10 of a cent per play. That is then split again, conventionally in half, between writer and publisher, which produces one of the strangest outcomes in the business. The person who wrote the song can be the smallest earner on their own record. And then there is what the industry calls, without embarrassment, the black box. Black box money is money that has been earned but cannot be delivered, because the paperwork connecting a recording to its writers is missing, misspelled, or was never filed. The song plays. The money moves. Nobody can prove who to send it to. When the Mechanical Licensing Collective was established in the United States, the streaming services handed over $424 million in historical unmatched royalties. Apple Music alone contributed more than $163 million. Spotify more than $152 million. Real songs, real listeners, real money, no confirmed owner. And there is a rule for what happens to what stays unclaimed. After a holding period, that money can be distributed to publishers based on market share. Read it slowly. When nobody can prove who wrote a song, the earnings drift toward whoever is already the biggest. In music, the default beneficiary of confusion is scale. Hold on to the difference between the recipe and the meal. Everything from here depends on it. Taylor Swift's first 6 albums were recorded for a Nashville label called Big Machine. She wrote the songs. Big Machine owned the recordings. In June 2019, Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings bought Big Machine for a reported $300 million. By her own account, Swift learned that her catalog had changed hands at the same moment the public did. A year later, Ithaca sold those master recordings onto a private equity firm, Shamrock Capital, for a figure Billboard reported at around $360 million. Sit with that. The recordings alone resold for more than the entire label had cost 12 months earlier. Not because she had recorded anything new, because in the space of a year, the market worked out what a permanent stream of royalties is actually worth. Her response was the only move the structure allowed. She re-recorded the albums from scratch. She could do that because of Level 4. She had never owned the meal. She had always owned the recipe. And every time a new version replaced an original in a film, an advert, or a playlist, the asset somebody else was holding got quietly smaller. In May 2025, she bought the originals back. Look at the shape of it. The most commercially dominant artist of her generation, in the middle of the highest-grossing tour ever staged, spent 6 years and a 9-figure sum acquiring something she had already made. At the top of this industry, leverage is not talent. It is not sales. It is not an audience of millions. It is the deed. And once music is understood as a deed, a different kind of buyer arrives, people with no intention of ever making anything. In 2024, Sony agreed to acquire the Queen catalog for a reported $1.27 billion, the largest music rights transaction on record. Earlier that same year, it paid a reported $600 million for half of Michael Jackson's, which prices the whole catalog at well over $1 billion. But the number that explains this level best is a smaller one. Bruce Springsteen's catalog reportedly sold for somewhere around $550 million against annual revenue estimated at roughly $15 million. That is about 37 times what it earns in a year. Nobody pays that kind of money for art alone. They pay for something that behaves like a bond. Not literally a bond. There is no issuer, no maturity date, no guaranteed coupon. But the resemblance is close enough for the people writing the checks. A catalog of songs people already love produces income that is recurring, long duration, and almost entirely disconnected from whether anyone does any work this year. Nobody has to write, record, tour, or promote for those royalties to arrive. They simply keep arriving, because the songs are already inside people's lives. That is why pension money and private equity spent a decade hunting for these. In a world of uncertain returns, a stream of cash that keeps showing up regardless of the news cycle is rare. So the buyer is not really buying the artist. They are buying the cash flow attached to the asset and the reasonable certainty that it will still be arriving in 20 years. Which is why the most revealing detail in the Queen deal is what was deliberately left out of it. Live performance income was excluded. Brian May and Roger Taylor kept it. There is a reason, and it explains the entire level. A recording can be copied infinitely and owned forever. A concert has to be performed on a specific night by a person who is still alive. Live is the only part of music that cannot be bought in perpetuity. So the buyers paid over $1 billion for the part that requires nobody to turn up. Which leaves one question. If the room is the only thing that can't be owned outright, who controls the room? Live Nation reported $25.2 billion of revenue for 2025. 159 million fans across 55,000 shows. Split that company in half and the whole industry becomes visible. Its concerts division, the part that books artists, hires crews, and physically puts people on stages, generated $20.9 billion in revenue and $687 million in adjusted operating income, a margin of 3.3%. The company described that as its best ever. Ticketmaster, its ticketing arm, generated $3.1 billion in revenue and $1.1 billion in adjusted operating income. Line those up. The ticketing business produced substantially more profit than the concerts business, on roughly 1/7 of the revenue. Everything that happens on the stage runs at about 3 cents on the dollar. The transaction in front of it runs at more than 30. And the reason is structural, not accidental. A concert is a physical operation with thousands of variable costs: trucks, crew, insurance, guarantees paid to artists, whether or not the room fills. Every show is a fresh risk. Ticketing is software. It was built once, and each additional ticket processed costs close to nothing. One side of the business absorbs all the uncertainty. The other simply takes a percentage of whatever passes through, and every fan must pass through it regardless of who is playing. The Justice Department's case put figures on how that position was defended. Live Nation, it alleged, controlled around 78% of large amphitheaters, and, through Ticketmaster, roughly 86% of primary ticketing at major concert venues. The case reached trial in March 2026, and Live Nation settled with the federal government mid-trial. It kept Ticketmaster. It agreed to cap service fees at 15%, open its venues to rival ticketing platforms, divest exclusive booking arrangements at 13 amphitheaters, and set aside $281 million for state damages. The states did not all take the deal. On the 15th of April, 2026, a jury found Live Nation and Ticketmaster liable on every antitrust count in front of it and attached a number to the harm: $1.72 per primary ticket sold. That is what 12 ordinary people decided the door was worth, per person, per night. Lay all 7 levels side by side, and the ladder resolves into 3 positions. You can make it. You write it, play it, and carry the gear. Highest risk, highest fixed costs, least protection. You can own it. You do not need to have made anything. You need to hold the rights, and hold them for a long time. Or you can stand between it and the listener. You make nothing, and you own nothing. You control the moment of access. Now rank those by margin. A touring artist keeps roughly 8% of a ticket. Live Nation's concerts arm keeps 3.3. Universal Music Group, which owns recordings and compositions, ran a 22.5% adjusted margin on 12.5 billion euros of revenue last year. Ticketmaster runs around 37. The further a business sits from the actual sound, the more of the money it keeps. That is held through vinyl, cassette, CD, download, and stream. Only the names on the toll booths changed. And the bottom of the ladder is about to get much stranger. Deezer, the only major platform publishing figures on this, reported that by June 2026, it was receiving around 90,000 fully AI-generated tracks per day, more than half of everything being uploaded. Those tracks account for only 1 to 3% of actual listening, and the platform says roughly 85% of even that thin slice is fraudulent. But the listening figure is not the point. The upload figure is. The cost of producing a competent recording is collapsing towards zero, while the number of recordings competing for one fixed pool heads toward infinity. When supply becomes unlimited, price does not survive it, which leaves 2 things in music that still hold value: catalogs people already love, and a room with a living person in it. So go back to the bedroom and the song being finished tonight on a laptop. Nothing about that scene has changed. It still costs almost nothing to make, and almost nothing to send around the world. What has changed is what you now know about what happens next. That song becomes a royalty stream. The royalty stream becomes a contract. The contract becomes a piece of property. The property becomes an investment. And somewhere down that chain, it becomes leverage. For somebody. The only open question is whose name is on it by then. The hardest part of making money from music was never making the music. It is keeping hold of what the music turns into. The instrument is not the instrument. The paperwork is the instrument.